Fishing in troubled waters. A Filipino civilian convoy that calls itself Atin Ito, meaning this is ours in Tagalog, claims to have breached China's so-called blockade around the Huangyan Dao in the South China Sea. The flotilla is said to have reached the shoal and resupplied Filipino fishermen operating there, but media reports suggest they stopped some 50 nautical miles from Huangyan Dao before returning. The mission was watched on by the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy. So what is it that the mission tries to accomplish? Are the fishermen being exploited? Are there other forces possibly behind this sudden assertiveness? Welcome to The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Haikou, China's southernmost province of Hainan, by Yan, Director of the Research Center of Oceans Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. From Brisbane, Australia, by Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, and in the studio by Victor Gao, chair professor at Suzhou University. My guests, welcome to The Point. First of all, I want to remind our audience, despite all the drama we're seeing on the media and social media, there has actually been a very important meeting that seems to have been overlooked by many people. China and ASEAN member states met this Monday and Wednesday in Thailand for ASEAN-China joint working group on the implementation of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, where all parties agreed to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea, continue to implement the DLC of parties, keep self-restraint and dialogue, and the meeting is quoted as to have pushed forward the third reading of a code of conduct in the area. Yan, let me go to you first. How important, what does the meeting tell us about the kind of effort that's going on among countries in the region with China to find a solution to the issues surrounding the South China Sea?
Well, the conference, actually, I saw the news and I noticed two keywords from the news, from the media. The first one is to maintain self-restraint, and the second one is to maintain dialogue and negotiation. So I think the first one of self-restraint is trying to send an information to the Philippines, and the second one to maintain dialogue and negotiation, I think, which can guarantee that COC negotiation is on the right track.
Right. And well, this is very good. Unfortunately, seems to have been ignored or overshadowed by the kind of activities that we're seeing in the South China Sea. And the timing is interesting to me as well. Victor, I want to ask you this question, because the timing of this meeting is almost exactly as the civilian mission by the Filipino activist group, or the Filipino activist group chose the timing of their resupply mission at almost exactly the time as this meeting between China and ASEAN to resolve their differences peacefully.
Well, first of all, the ASEAN-China dialogue has been very important for promoting stability, peace, and development in the South China Sea as a whole, because there are quite a few ASEAN members which are littoral states to the South China Sea, many of which are having very good relations with China and are dedicated to solving whatever problems there are through peaceful dialogue and negotiations. Philippines is one of the 10 ASEAN member states, but Philippines apparently chose to go the other way. That is to confront China and to raise the tension for the disputed area between China and the Philippines. And this is against the general trend of the ASEAN as a whole, as demonstrated in the ASEAN-China dialogue. So I hope eventually Philippines will come back to the ASEAN-China dialogue framework to really promote peace and stability and to promote the real prosperity for the Filipino people. That's the right way, and that's the highway.
We'll come to that in just a moment. For instance, the interests of the fishermen that have to stay in the waters in order to, play a part in that optics we are seeing. But we are joined from Washington, D.C. by Anton Filiashin, Associate Professor of History at the American University. Anton, welcome to The Point. What is your understanding of the kind of position of the Philippines in the broader context context of the position of other countries that also are party to some of the disputes. For instance, Vietnam seems to have a policy to not let the maritime disputes dominate the relationship it has with China, and which is on an upward trajectory. Indonesia, for instance, on the South China Sea, at the beginning of this year, Indonesia's senior leader in diplomacy says Indonesia is ready to work together with all ASEAN member states, including the Philippines, to finalize the code of conduct as soon as possible. Other countries also have taken a rather neutral and constrained way to approach this issue. Why is the Philippines ostensibly breaking away from the collective position of the ASEAN?
There are two things that are really important here. One of them is, of course, the position and the role of President Marcos of the Philippines, who has taken a fairly pro-American attitude towards his neighbors. The second issue is whether China has the patience to see diplomacy as an interaction, a process, as something that takes time and takes patience, and is not a question of posturing and provocation, but is a question of simply dealing with problems that basically face every country quietly and patiently. ASEAN faces a very important question right now, whether it can be a constructive regional organization where China works with its partners, or whether it can be hijacked by other Pacific powers, and whether it can be used, or at least some of its members can be used to provoke China or any of the other Pacific powers into some sort of conflict that can then be turned into a proxy war, such as what's going on the other side of Eurasia right now. So far, the Chinese have played their cards very intelligently, calmly, and patiently, and that's, after all, the essence of wise diplomacy. I have a sense that ASEAN will not let this get out of hand, because it seems like the majority of its members understand that a sharpening of the standoff over islands, territorial waters, is simply in no one's interest. So we'll see what happens. But so far, I'm cautiously optimistic that this can be worked out.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about other forces, other other Pacific powers, and not in the interest of everybody, but probably in the interest of some countries which are not directly bordering the South China Sea, and I'm talking about the United States. And we have some historical context here, because the Huangyan Dao is part of disputed features in the South China Sea that also includes, for instance, the Nansha Qingdao, or in English, the Spratlers. And from a look at the U.S. State Department archive, we can find that the Secretary of State of the United States back then wrote to the U.S. Embassy in Manila in 1947 that the Spratly Islands, or Nansha, which were occupied by France in 1933, were seized by the Japanese and annexed in 1939. With the end of the war, the French and the Chinese have again reasserted their claim to the islands. It is difficult to see exactly where the Philippines fit into the picture. That's what their position on the Philippines claim it was. Then a few years later, in 1956, then Under Secretary of State Robert Murphy wrote that the United States has not taken any position on the validity of the claims now in existence, nor has it expressed an opinion on the present Philippine activity in the area. It is possible, however, that future developments might make it advisable to modify this position in order to keep these islands out of communist hands and under the control of a reliable and competent friendly power. Warwick, what do these archives tell us about the U.S. position, whether it was weighing international law or geopolitics?
Well, I think it speaks directly to the role of geopolitics in America's actions, particularly in this part of the world of late. What we're witnessing at the moment is the triumph of a spectacle over substance. The fact of the matter is, the region has a long history of actually navigating complex border relationships and interaction relationships well before Europeans or Americans came into the area. And we're experiencing at the moment, I guess, an episode of conscious efforts to destabilise multilateral efforts to secure a new détente that works for the countries of the region. So the question that really should be asked is, in whose interests is this instability? And I think it is quite clear that the interest of stability is actually for the countries and the peoples of the region, and it's external forces for whom instability will do the most benefit for. And that's unfortunately where we're at the moment.
Another very interesting archive also found in the official archive of the U.S. State Department was a document written in 1956 by the State Department. It says, it seems to be that the United States could profitably encourage Vietnam and the Philippines to effect jointly a procedure which would prevent Chicom occupation or use of the Spratly Group. Chicom was the term the U.S. used to refer to New China back then. Victor, do you think this kind of strategic consideration has altered? How has it shaped U.S. policy till today?
Well, first of all, for all the countries in this part of the world, the boundary for the Philippines is actually well defined because there are two big events. One was the Spanish-American War in 1898, and the United States defeated the Spanish Empire, and there was a treaty between the United States and Spain which clearly outlined the boundary of the Philippines. Every inch of land belonging to the Philippines was taken by the United States from the Spanish, meaning every inch of land which the United States did not take from the Spanish in 1898 did not belong to the Philippines. That's number one. Number two was this unconditional surrender of the Japanese fascists in 1945, because Japan grabbed the Philippines from the United States and occupied the Philippines in 1941 to 1945. And after being defeated by the United States in 1945, Japan actually surrendered every inch of land which belonged to the Philippines to the United States, meaning every inch of land belonging to the Philippines was taken back by the American troops under General MacArthur, and every inch of land which the United States did not take back from Japan occupation did not belong to the Philippines. So we need to go back to the Treaty of 1898 and the Japanese unconditional surrender in 1945 to remind all of us what exactly was the Filipino territory. It's well defined, it's written in treaties and documents, and I don't think anyone should pretend that islands, atolls, shoals in the South China Sea were unoccupied, as the Philippines later claimed, starting from the 1970s. And whatever the United States tried to do through one document or another could not change the real situation on the ground in the South China Sea, because we have these two very important historical events, 1898 and 1945.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the U.S. Official archive seems to tell us what the real intention of the U.S. government has been in private. And Yan, although publicly the U.S. claims neutrality, on the South China Sea. But recently, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has reiterated the United States' ironclad commitment to defend the Philippines. That was in March this year. Do you think the United States' position has changed on these islands because of its geopolitical rivalry or competition against China since the last 10 years?
Yes, I personally do think that the U.S. position has changed. Well, back in the 1990s, I think the U.S. position is relatively neutral and made many claims and stated that they will stay neutral and not take position on territorial sovereignty issues in the South China Sea. But now, especially after the pivot to Asia policy in the Obama administration, we do see that the United States has been taking sides even on territorial issues in the South China Sea. And if you look at the hotspots and the conflict, every conflict in the South China Sea, the United States' position is always on the opposite side of China. For example, in the recently Scarborough Shoal issue, we do see the current model is the Philippines designed and created a conflict in the disputed features and waters, and then the U.S. funded media and also their U.S. think tanks retreated this information and news and trying to make it world known and trying to make China's image of a bully in the South China Sea. So we do see that the U.S. position has changed largely.
Yeah, well, although the U.S. position has changed, it seems that the China poking toolkit has been more or less the same. If you read the archives from the U.S., the France, and the English, historically, they've always wanted to take China to court over territory issues. Of course, who were the judges? The Westerners. Who wrote the laws? The Westerners in international law. But it seems that right now, the same China poking toolkit is in place. Anton, do you see it that way? And if so, why is the Marcos government allowing itself to be used as a proxy of the United States? And this is for Anton, please.
It fits its geopolitical vision of the Philippines playing a role that is without U.S. support above its weight, but with U.S. backing, the advantage to getting its way is there. I think that everything that you've quoted from the documents, especially the 1950s one, points to strategic ambiguity, a term that everyone in China, of course, knows, and in the Asia-Pacific part knows. This is the instrumentalization of strategic ambiguity. This brings us right back to this question of a rules-based order that we constantly hear about from the West, where no one really understands what the rules are, but they are defined by really one power, the United States. And it depends on what the geopolitical position of the U.S. is at any given point of time. And then islands, waters, borders, expansions of military blocks are simply used to promote American interests. I think that the interests of the Philippines themselves and of President Marcos are really even less important. The question is the United States preserving its hegemony across the planet, which is slowly slipping from its hands. And the best thing for China to do is to behave like an adult, which so far is exactly what Beijing has been doing, not to allow itself to be provoked, not to allow a proxy war to break out, and to simply work with ASEAN, work with all of its neighbors and members of all sorts of organizations of which China is part, to simply allow this to die, the controversy, to die a slow and quiet death, and to simply move on and trade and work on the One Belt, One Road initiative.
However, it is rather difficult because you have the social media, you have all kinds of mouthpieces coming up with day in, day out updates on what's happening. You have these activist groups. We don't know the connection between certain activist group and the American government. There's a myriad of information outlets that seems to be muddying the water, Warwick. And you're seeing the fishermen, the ordinary people, seeing civilians ostensibly or apparently being bullied by the big neighbor China. There is the complexity of the issue. What do you think of that? What is happening there?
Look, once again, I think the United States is focused on a game plan built around propaganda as it mobilizes, or it seeks to mobilize what it would see as the court of global public opinion to paint a particular picture of the circumstance. But let's put this into historical context as well. Firstly, the entire Pacific Ocean was seen after the Second World War, as Victor mentioned, as America's lake. So what's happening at the moment in terms of the changing balance of power in the Western Pacific is a fundamental challenge to America's own defined sense of destiny and control over this part of the world. I think that that's very important to remember, because even during the period where there was relative calm and relative ambiguity in terms of its posture, its deep underlying position has always been that should there be any challenge to its control and dominance and primacy in this part of Asia and this part of the Pacific, then it would do something about it. And that's exactly what it's doing now. It's pursuing a propaganda-driven proxy building, grooming activity, which unfortunately mirrors the kind of preparation work that the US entertained from the period 2007 through to 2022 in Ukraine. And my fear is that we're going to see a situation where ordinary Filipino people will end up becoming part of to the last Filipino as opposed to the last Ukrainian.
Elaborate on that a little bit more, Warwick, because this is not just you, this viewpoint is also shared by some other people who are saying for a smaller country who try to play this game of power, try to leverage two big powers, it's very dangerous. And right now, Ukraine seems to have been sacrificed for the sake of the big power politician.
Look, in a multipolar environment, achieving stability and security is in everybody's interests because it provides the environment in which economic development and social progress can take place. But to achieve that, you've got to take into account the interests of all, and that means developing a framework that accepts the indivisibility of security. There's no point trying to pursue this particular issue in a bilateral context when it must be resolved in a multilateral environment. The ASEAN-China dialogue is the key institution through which multipolarity can play its role in the region. The downside of multipolarity is that it is a slower process. Building consensus takes time and effort. And it also requires a level of patience and adult behaviour that enables all parties to have their room and their dignity preserved whilst delicate discussions and negotiations are taking place. If you spend your time playing social media games, the objective isn't to contribute to sustainable peace and stability in a region. Your objective actually is to destabilize a region which is not in the interests of the people of the region.
Yeah, you gain clicks. You gain, clicks, but you're not constructive. Whereas the meeting of people sitting down talking to each other is optically very boring. Victor, you wanted to say something?
Well, I would say we should not be too agitated about this recent increase of tension initiated by the Philippines against China in the disputed South China Sea. Why? Because purely between China and the Philippines, I think all these disputes could be discussed in peaceful way, in amicable way through diplomacy, etc., as, for example, with the previous Filipino government. Now, Philippines being aided and abetted by the United States, which wants to turn the Philippines into a proxy for a larger geopolitical game plan against China. But that game plan is not going to be dictated by the China-Filipino territorial disputes, because I truly believe between China and the United States, there are other things much more important than this territorial dispute between China and the Philippines that China and the United States need to think about and care about. That means China-US relations have its own logic and its own dynamics. And both countries should avoid war between these two largest economies in the world and should really learn how to calm down and embrace the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Therefore, I think the situation may continue to worsen for a while between China and the Philippines. China really need to, as the previous panelist mentioned, stay very calm, refuse to be agitated, use reason, use persuasion, urge for diplomacy and negotiation, and try to calm Philippines down. Because the history is well written. The history is not going to be dictated by the United States itself.
Of course, you need both hands to make a clap, as the Chinese saying goes. Yan, but China did release videos, for instance, of its maritime police vessels patrolling or near the Huangyan Dao, and China is sending a very strong message. Why is China doing that right ahead of this mission, while China is also calling on restraint and patience?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to follow the previous question and previous comment on the COC, China-ASEAN and China-Philippines relations. Well, I wanted to emphasize one thing, that the COC is not a dispute settlement mechanism. Thus, it cannot solve the sovereignty dispute between China and the Philippines, and also cannot solve the maritime delimitation dispute between the 5 claimant states. And we have to remember that only 4 of the 10 ASEAN countries are claimant states of the territorial sovereignty in the South China Sea. And that's why the Philippines is very clear of that. And it does not rely on the COC and the negotiations on the multilateral platform to solve the dispute, so that it wants to
some people are asking, let me take this
actions.
opportunity. Some people are asking, why does China not sit down multilaterally and resolve the territorial disputes? Why does China insist on bilateral negotiations, one-on-one, with these claimant countries?
If you look at the disputes in the whole world, territorial dispute and maritime delimitation dispute, it's all between parties of directly involved. Well, of the 10 ASEAN member states, only 4, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, have claimed territorial sovereignty over the features in the South China Sea. If you think of this multilateral platform, like China-ASEAN ones, dialogues, well, you see that the Cambodia, the Laos, the Singapore, Thailand, they have nothing to do with this dispute. So what's their position, or they are not the players in the game. And thus, we think that if you look at the whole world's maritime disputes, we do see that the best way to solve the dispute is through direct negotiations and dialogues between the parties directly
But what's China's
involved.
message by sending the videos of the Coast Guard, of the Maritime Police, right before the civilian mission?
Well, you see, China, well, I already mentioned before that the Philippines and also the US media are trying to create some fake news and fake false stories and trying to make China an image of a bully. Well, what I think China has been doing is trying to increase the transparency in all these conflicts in the South China Sea and trying to show the world what is really happening in the South China Sea. We do see that the capability of the Chinese Coast Guard has been improving throughout the years. And we also see that this shows China's determination to safeguard our territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the South China Sea.
Well, when China shows its transparency, it's called bully. When China doesn't show its transparency, it's called a gray zone tactic. That's very interesting. Anyway, it's an endless game, and I guess we won't spend too much of our time talking about it. Many thanks to my guests, Yan, Director of the Research Center of Oceans, Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Anton Fediashin, Associate Professor of History at American University, Warwick Power, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology, and Victor Cao, Chair Professor at Suzhou University. Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for joining us. You've got the point.